The fear. I always had a penchant for old electronics, so when I stumbled upon a vintage shortwave radio at a flea market, I couldn't resist buying it. The radio was in surprisingly good condition, its dials and knobs gleaming despite the layers of dust. That night, I set it up in my living room, eager to see what frequencies I could pick up. After hours of fiddling with the dials, I found a station broadcasting eerie, old-time radio dramas. The stories were chilling, filled with ghostly encounters and inexplicable phenomena. As the night wore on, the stories seemed to blur the line between fiction and reality. I felt an odd sense of unease, as if something was listening back through the speakers. The next evening, I tuned in again. This time, the broadcast seemed to be directed at me. The narrator described a man, alone in his home, listening to a mysterious radio broadcast. The details were unnervingly specific, mirroring my own life. The man in the story heard whispers behind him, and as I listened, I too heard faint whispers, though I was alone in the room. Determined to understand what was happening, I researched the radio's origins. It had been manufactured in the 1940s by a company that went out of business shortly after a series of mysterious deaths among its employees. That night, the broadcast was filled with static and fragmented messages, but one thing was clear: a voice calling my name over and over. I confided in my friend Mark about the strange broadcasts. He was skeptical but agreed to come over and listen to me. As we sat in the darkened room, the radio crackled to life. The story that night was about two friends investigating a haunted radio. Mark laughed it off, but then the lights flickered, and the room grew cold. The broadcast ended abruptly, leaving us in an eerie silence. The next day, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in red ink: "Stop listening." Chilled to the bone, I decided to take a break from the radio. But curiosity got the better of me, and that night, I turned it on again. The voice on the other end sounded frantic, warning me of impending danger if I continued to listen. That night, I was awakened by a loud knock at the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. I called out, but there was no response. The figure eventually left, but the next morning, I found deep scratches on the front door, as if something had tried to force its way in. Desperate for answers, I dug deeper into the radio's past. I discovered that its previous owner, a man named Henry Lawson, had vanished under mysterious circumstances. His wife claimed he had been driven mad by the voices on the radio, insisting that they were real and trying to communicate with him. Ignoring the previous warnings, I turned the radio on again. This time, the broadcast was different. It was Henry Lawson's voice, recounting his experiences with the radio. He spoke of a realm beyond our own, accessed through certain frequencies, inhabited by malevolent entities seeking a way into our world. His final words were a desperate plea: "Turn it off before it's too late." I began to see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging me to listen to the radio at specific times. The fear that something was trying to breach the veil between worlds consumed me. Mark, concerned for my sanity, suggested we destroy the radio. Reluctantly, I agreed. We took it to the backyard, intending to smash it with a sledgehammer. But as we raised the hammer, the radio turned on by itself, emitting a high-pitched screech. The air around us shimmered, and for a moment, we saw a portal opening, revealing a dark, twisted landscape. We fled inside, barricading the door. The radio's screeching continued, echoing through the house. Suddenly, it stopped, replaced by a calm, soothing voice promising safety if we tuned in again. Despite everything, I felt an overwhelming urge to listen. Mark had to physically restrain me from going back outside. Over the next few days, I felt a presence growing stronger, as if something had attached itself to me. I experienced blackouts, losing hours at a time with no memory of what I had done. Mark noticed changes in my behavior, my eyes taking on a vacant, distant look. He suggested an exorcism, but I was skeptical. In a last-ditch effort, we contacted a local medium. She arrived with an array of protective charms and began a ritual to cleanse the house. As she chanted, the radio came to life, broadcasting a guttural growl. The medium's face contorted in fear, and she abruptly stopped, claiming the presence was too powerful. Determined to end the haunting, I decided to confront the entity head-on. I tuned the radio to the exact frequency the voices had indicated. The room darkened, and the air grew thick. I demanded to know what it wanted. The voice responded, "Release us," followed by a chilling laugh. The temperature dropped, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I found a book on ancient rituals in the attic, buried among old belongings. The book detailed a method to close the portal and banish the entities. With Mark's help, I gathered the necessary materials and performed the ritual. The radio blared violently, emitting screams and cries as if the entities were being torn from our world. The ritual was met with fierce resistance. Objects flew around the room, and the shadows took on more solid forms, clawing at us. Mark and I held our ground, reciting the incantations louder and with more conviction. The radio's screams grew deafening, but we continued, determined to see it through. As the ritual reached its climax, the book mentioned a sacrifice needed to seal the portal permanently. With a heavy heart, I realized what had to be done. I took a knife and cut my palm, letting the blood drip onto the radio. The entities screamed in rage, and the portal began to close, the dark landscape receding. When the ritual ended, the house fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the shadows vanished. The radio, now covered in blood, was silent and lifeless. Mark and I collapsed, exhausted but relieved that the ordeal was finally over. We buried the radio in the backyard, hoping it would never be unearthed again. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The haunting ceased, and I no longer felt the presence of the entities. However, the experience had left its mark on me. I avoided anything related to the paranormal, and the sight of a radio sent chills down my spine. The memories of those harrowing nights stayed with me, a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. The frequencies. It all started when I found the old radio in my grandmother's attic. It was an antique, a dusty relic from the 1940s with large knobs and a cracked speaker. Intrigued by its vintage charm, I brought it home, planning to restore it. Little did I know that this radio would soon become the source of my nightmares. After some tinkering, I managed to get the radio working. Late one night, as I was tuning through static, a voice broke through. It was an old-timey radio show, complete with crackling sound effects and eerie music. The announcer's voice was deep and resonant, introducing a story called The House on Hollow Hill. I listened, captivated by the story of a haunted house and its tormented inhabitants. The sound quality was strangely clear, as if it were being broadcast live. As the tale reached its climax, the room grew colder, and I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The story ended with a blood-curdling scream that seemed to echo through my entire apartment. The next night, I tuned in again, eager for another story. This time, it was a tale about a man lost in the woods, pursued by unseen horrors. As I listened, I heard faint whispers around me, almost as if the voices from the radio were leaking into my reality. I brushed it off as my imagination and continued listening. Strange things started happening around the apartment. Objects moved on their own, and I saw fleeting shadows out of the corner of my eye. The radio stories grew more sinister, each one more disturbing than the last. I couldn't help but listen, drawn to the eerie broadcasts night after night. One evening, I had a friend over. We were chatting in the living room when the radio suddenly turned on. The same announcer's voice filled the room, recounting a tale of a vengeful ghost. My friend turned pale and insisted we turn it off, saying he felt like someone was watching us. The atmosphere grew heavy with an unseen presence. That night, I experienced sleep paralysis for the first time. I woke up unable to move, with a heavy weight on my chest. A dark figure stood at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing red. It whispered in the same voice as the radio announcer, recounting the ending of the night story. When I finally broke free, the radio was on, playing static. Determined to understand what was happening, I began researching the radio's origins. I discovered it had once belonged to a man named Victor Holloway, a radio host who vanished under mysterious circumstances in the 1940s. His final broadcast was said to be cursed, and those who listened to it would be haunted by his voice. I found a forum of paranormal enthusiasts who knew about Victor Holloway and his cursed broadcasts. They warned me to stop listening immediately, but I was too deep into the mystery to back out. I learned that Victor's final broadcast, the Holloway incident, had never been aired publicly. Only a few had heard it, and they had all disappeared or gone mad. Ignoring the warnings, I decided to listen to the forbidden broadcast. As I turned the radio, the air grew colder, and the static intensified. Suddenly, Victor's voice came through, clearer than ever. He began recounting the events of his final night, describing his descent into madness and the dark forces that claimed him. As Victor's story unfolded, I felt a presence in the room. The temperature dropped, and the shadows grew darker. I saw Victor's apparition, gaunt and hollow-eyed, standing by the radio. He spoke directly to me, warning that I had unleashed something terrible by listening to his stories. He vanished, leaving behind a sense of foreboding. The paranormal activity in my apartment escalated. Doors slammed shut, objects flew across the room, and I heard disembodied voices calling my name. Each night, the radio turned on by itself, broadcasting new stories filled with horror and despair. Sleep became impossible as I was tormented by nightmares and shadowy figures. Desperate for help, I reached out to a paranormal investigator named Claire. She had a reputation for dealing with haunted objects and agreed to come to my apartment. Claire immediately sensed the dark energy emanating from the radio and performed a cleansing ritual, hoping to banish whatever was haunting me. During the ritual, Claire had a vision. She saw Victor Holloway performing his final broadcast, surrounded by shadowy figures whispering in his ear. They were ancient spirits, feeding on fear and despair. Claire realized that Victor had made a pact with these entities, and they were now using the radio to spread their influence. Claire and I devised a plan to break the pact. We needed to find Victor's original script for the Holloway incident and destroy it. I returned to the attic where I had found the radio and discovered a hidden compartment. Inside was Victor's script, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. That night, we prepared to destroy the script. As we burned it, the radio crackled and hissed, as if the spirits were fighting back. Victor's voice screamed through the speaker, a sound filled with both rage and relief. The temperature in the room spiked, and a blinding light filled the space. Then, everything went silent. With the script destroyed, the haunting ceased. The radio fell silent, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Claire assured me that the spirits had been banished and Victor's soul was finally at rest. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully, free from nightmares and shadows. Life slowly returned to normal. I kept the radio as a reminder of the ordeal, though I never turned it on again. The apartment felt lighter, and the sense of being watched was gone. Claire stayed in touch, checking in to make sure there were no lingering effects from the haunting. Months passed without incident. I found a new appreciation for life, having survived such a harrowing experience. I moved on, but the memory of Victor and his haunted broadcasts stayed with me. It was a story I would never forget, a reminder of the dark forces that lurk just beyond our understanding. One night, out of curiosity, I turned on the radio one last time. Static filled the room, and then, faintly, I heard Victor's voice. It was different now, calm and at peace. He thanked me for freeing him and warned me to be cautious, for there were still many haunted frequencies out there. The radio fell silent, and I knew this was truly the end. The static. I found the old radio at a flea market. Its wooden casing was scratched and worn, but it had a charm I couldn't resist. The seller told me it was from the 1930s, and despite its age, it still worked. That night, I set it up in my living room, eager to see if it could still pick up any stations. To my surprise, the radio crackled to life. I turned the dial, searching for a clear station, when I stumbled upon an old-time radio show. The voice was crisp and clear, recounting a chilling story about a haunted house. I listened, captivated until the story ended abruptly with a burst of static. The next night, I tuned in again at the same time. This time, the story was about a cursed object that brought misfortune to anyone who possessed it. As the narrator's voice filled the room, I felt an eerie sensation, as if the story was meant just for me. When the broadcast ended, I realized I was the only one who had ever heard these stories. One night, as I was tuning in, I heard a voice amidst the static. It was faint, almost a whisper, but I could make out the words, "Help me." I froze, staring at the radio. The voice repeated, more urgent this time. I tried to respond, but the static swallowed my words. Determined to understand the strange broadcasts, I researched the radio's history. I discovered that it once belonged to a man named Henry Prescott, a radio show host in the 1930s who vanished under mysterious circumstances. His final broadcast was rumored to have been about his disappearance. That night, I tuned in again, hoping to hear more. The story was about a man named Henry who was being pursued by a malevolent entity. As the story progressed, I realized it was mirroring Prescott's life. The voice in the static returned, pleading for help. It was Henry. I contacted a local paranormal investigator named Sarah. She was skeptical at first but agreed to help when I played the recordings of the broadcasts. We set up equipment around the radio and waited for the next transmission. The air grew thick with anticipation as the radio crackled to life. As the story unfolded, Sarah and I noticed a cold spot forming near the radio. Suddenly, an apparition appeared, a translucent figure of a man. It was Henry. He looked directly at us, his eyes filled with desperation. He tried to speak, but only static emerged from his mouth. After Henry's appearance, strange things began happening in my house. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered, and I heard footsteps when no one was there. Sarah believed Henry was trying to communicate but was being blocked by something sinister. Sarah conducted a seance to try and reach Henry directly. As we held hands, the temperature in the room dropped, and a dark presence filled the air. We heard a deep, guttural growl, and the radio emitted a high-pitched screech. The entity was making its presence known. We delved deeper into Prescott's past and discovered he had been investigating a series of mysterious deaths linked to a cult that worshipped a dark entity. Henry's final broadcast was meant to expose the cult, but he disappeared before he could finish. The next broadcast was different. It was a warning from Henry, detailing the cult's practices and their attempts to summon the entity. The broadcast ended with Henry's panicked voice saying, "They're coming for me." The static that followed was deafening. Sarah suggested that we needed to perform a cleansing ritual to break the entity's hold on Henry. We gathered the necessary materials and prepared for the ritual. The house was eerily quiet, as if waiting for us to make our move. As we began the ritual, the entity attacked. The temperature plummeted, and a fierce wind whipped through the room. Objects flew off shelves, and the radio blared with a cacophony of voices. Henry appeared again, his face contorted in pain. We pressed on, chanting louder. Amid the chaos, there was a moment of clarity. Henry's voice broke through the static, clear and strong. He directed us to a hidden compartment in the radio, where we found a set of old, yellowed documents, Prescott's notes on the cult. With the notes in hand, we confronted the entity. Using Prescott's information, we called upon the protective spirits he had mentioned. The air crackled with energy as the entity fought back, but we held firm, our voices rising in unison. After what felt like an eternity, the entity's presence began to wane. The radio emitted one last burst of static before falling silent. Henry appeared one final time, a look of gratitude on his face. "Thank you," he whispered, before fading away. The house was finally at peace. The poltergeist activity ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Sarah and I were exhausted but relieved. We knew the battle was over, but the experience had left its mark on us. I decided to keep the radio, not as a reminder of the horror, but as a tribute to Henry Prescott. I restored it, and it became a centerpiece in my living room. Occasionally, I would turn it on, half hoping to hear Henry's voice again, but the broadcasts had ceased. Life slowly returned to normal, but I remained vigilant, aware that the paranormal was real and could manifest in unexpected ways. Sarah and I stayed in touch, and she often consulted me on new cases. The radio, once a conduit for terror, now stood as a symbol of our victory over the darkness. Henry's story had been told, and his spirit was finally at rest.